Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that invitation. Thank you all for being here. I am truly delighted and honored to be giving this annual lecture. So this is a talk about theater, about women, and about war. I myself am a theater woman, in a sense. I am a former actress, and although now a historian, my work is all on theater, and I've spent nearly 2 decades studying theater in Ukraine. Also, since 2022, I've been teaching 1 course a semester online in the program in theater studies at National University of Lviv. So in my teaching, I teach Ukrainian theater students and American liberal arts college students. I study theater, and I'm currently writing a book about theater women in Ukraine over the long 20th century. So I know something about it. And studying theater in Ukraine, as I will explain, means studying theater during the war. This moment is a significant one for theater right now in Ukraine. There are new people telling new stories for often new audiences. Theater has been picked up, as you see, as a relevant topic by news outlets such as the New York Times and CNN and Deutsche Welle. But this new interest, I think, often misses the historical context, that theater has always played a significant role in these lands during war. And these stories also generally miss women's very large role in theater today. So I want to take you on a deeper dive into theater and women and war to show you 3 things. First, I want to demonstrate that there is an epistemology of theater. That is, theater helps us know things. It helps us know things about society. We learn about Ukraine by examining its theater. Second, women's roles in theater are understudied and often undervalued. But when we include women in the picture, we see the picture differently. And third, war has consistently shaped theater in Ukraine. And Ukraine actually has a lot to offer the wider fields of theater studies and cultural history. And this last argument actually contributes to decolonizing the field, actually. It's a term that we use a lot, but for me it means challenging the geographies of where gets to be universal, generally Western Europe or Russia, to inspire universal concepts, universal theories, and where is relegated to the merely national, which is generally places in Eastern Europe. Piotr Piotrowski wrote about this really well. He said you've got modernism, but then you have Polish modernism, right? Why can't Polish modernism just be modernism? And I'm here very much citing Marko Pawlishin, Piotr Piotrowski, and Dipesh Chakrabarty. So put another way, I don't want to just show you how fascinating theater in Ukraine is, although it is, but I want my colleagues in theater studies and history writ large to include Ukraine and to bring Ukraine to them, because then we can have larger conversations about theater as a space of resilience, about theater and trauma, about the meaning of telling stories during times of crisis. That is, theater in Ukraine as a scholarly topic should move from the specific to the universal to become part of larger comparative and analytic discussions beyond the field of Ukrainian studies, precisely because of the way theater and war are so intertwined in this region, and I would say theater and women and war. So let me explain some of my terms for you as I weave together these 3 themes of theater, women, and war. So I want to share for you my concept of theater for our discussion. So people often think about theater as a text, a play, right? A staged performance. What we see on the stage, design choices, acting choices. But let us consider theater as an ecosystem. It's artists and performances, but it's also audiences, stakeholders, officials, theater students, critics, funders, buildings, managers, as well as the stories created by those individuals, institutions, and infrastructures. The stories people tell us in those ecosystems tell us about themselves. Theater, wrote Marvin Carlson, has always provided society with the most tangible records of its attempts to understand its own operations. Now, I'll say in the US, that might be less true. For us, film or Netflix series might be more of a mirror. But in places like Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, where authoritarian regimes censored society, cultural production took on an outsized significance. And that has largely actually continued after the Soviet collapse. So theater is, in this region of the world, a central place of meaning making. I am am also specifically talking about women in theater, and I want to be clear about that. We could discuss gender more broadly, of course, the masculinity of the theater profession, the ways gender roles are shaped by theatrical texts, but I'm really focusing on women in this ecosystem of theater women, precisely because theater has always been a male-dominated industry. And we only see that and its consequences when we focus on women and when we draw out their lives and careers. Susan Bennett writes of making theater history, demonstrating that the archive is indeed made according to certain categories that actually often obscure female labor. So she argues for decomposing the archive in order to remake theater history, revalue what is considered worthy of scholarly attention. Charlotte Canning argues that the 20th century was the century of the theater director, and most directors were male. So theater scholarship generally highlights men's contribution to theater. So we need to actually intentionally shift our focus to women to see the full picture of how creative work actually happens. And finally, war has shaped women's lives and careers in Ukraine in almost every generation. Theater women in Ukraine have survived and survive occupation, front lines, changing borders, violence, and that shapes their trajectories. And one of the specificities of theater in Ukraine is that so much of it unfolds in war. And perhaps surprisingly, it's not surprising to me as a theater person, but it is surprising to some people, even in times of crisis, people went to the theater, and people made theater. When Kiev was changing hands over 10 times during the years after World War I, people went to the theater. In the small towns racked by pogroms in the Polish Bolshevik War, people went to the theater. Between 1939 and 1945, when Ukrainian lands were under occupation, people went to the theater. And now, people are going to the theater in wartime, despite war, especially during war. And actually, actresses' memoirs written later can really frustrate with their avoidance of the wartime context, focusing obsessively only on, often in painstaking detail, their theater work, the choices that they made as an artist. But scholarship on the war, in the same way, can frustrate with its exclusive focus on violence, ignoring the often bizarre explosion of art that might have been happening at the same time. So, in the scholarship, violence seems separate from theater, but it's actually not, as the sources demonstrate. And I think by placing theater in its wartime context, we can more clearly see the dynamic between art and life. Why work gets made, when it does, where it does, how it does. I also want to explain my understanding of Ukraine. I work on theater in Ukraine, not always Ukrainian language theater. Ukraine is a place. It's a place shaped by experiences where people's lives unfolded in specific ways. It is a place connected with and central to other fields of study, not just Ukrainian studies, Jewish studies and history, Eastern European, Soviet, Russian history and studies. The theater women in my book are all a part of this region, whatever their ethnicity or in whatever language they happen to be performing, whether it was Ukrainian or Russian or Yiddish or Polish. And my argument is about the region, right, versus one group of people in that region. So in this talk, I will introduce you to several theater women and their work in theater in wartime. And taken collectively, they will tell you about the epistemology of theater, they will highlight how women shift our picture of theater history, and they will explain what Ukraine can tell us about theater and war. So my first case study is probably quite well known to people in this room, but if not, I'll go over the basics. Let's talk about Les Curbas and Berezil. So many of you know this director and his theater. In case you don't, Curbas was famous, he was smart, he was talented. He was trained in Vienna and Lemberg, as it was known in the Habsburg Empire at the time. He ran a theater company during war, during the Russian occupation of Ternopil in 1915. He moved to Kiev in 1916 and really started, honestly, a theatrical revolution. He shaped the Ukrainian language stage. He brought modern, European, and American plays to Ukraine, training up an entire generation, shaping the idea of what a company was, what theater training was, and literally changing the meaning of theater in Ukraine. And he's recently been rediscovered by a new generation, looking to him for inspiration as they disentangle themselves from the Stanislavski-dominated and Moscow-dominated Soviet theater. But let's pause. Kurbas did not do all of that on his own. And there are two overlooked aspects about Kurbas that I want to highlight here. And first is the complicated gender dynamics in his company. So on the one hand, he actually gave positions to women to run various Berezil workshops in the 1920s. He envisioned his theater as not just sort of one theater, but a lot of different workshops for workers, for children, for people in certain regions. And he actually gave the leadership of those workshops often to women whom he really mentored and mentored up in his company. Zinaida Pihulovich, for example, she's in the middle here, was the only woman in Kurbas's director's lab, and he gave her the children's theater workshop to run with her husband, Faust Lobotinsky. That's great. But on the other hand, of course, she's the only woman in Kurbas's directing lab, and she later notes in a memoir that she couldn't join the theater company in 1926 because she was about to become a mother. Right? So why, because she was pregnant, could she not join the theater company? And in fact, Kurbas at one point apparently said that women shouldn't have children, and there was only one production at Berezil written and directed by a woman, Kurbas's wife, interestingly called Comrade Woman. And when we really focus on the absence of women's voices, we realize the peculiar conservatism of the avant-garde. It's actually very normal, right? Avant-garde movements are often very avant-garde in one way and very not avant-garde in the other, and Soviet Ukraine was no exception. So all the talk of Kurbas keeps the woman who made his shows possible somewhat in the shadows. But the second overlooked aspect of Berezil, which honestly I never really thought about until 2022, is that Berezil is a post-war story. War actually helps us understand Berezil, and women in war help give a real new context to Berezil. So let's return to Zinaida Pihulovich, one of the theater women of this talk. She was actually in medical school in Kiev. She was aiming to become a doctor during the collapse of the Romanov dynasty in the Russian Empire. Maybe because of that, in any case, she ditched her medical school studies to join the Lysenko School of Music and Drama, which was where one studied theater, if one could, in Kiev at the time. She started her program in fall 1918. So just think about that. Fall 1918. Okay. The Russian Empire collapsed. The Central Rada had emerged in Kiev. The Bolshevik occupation of January 1918 was actually very violent in the city. Another actress was wounded in the face during shelling. The Skoropadsky Hetmanate/German occupation was still standing when Pihulovich started her studies, but it was obviously about to collapse. So in her first semester at theater school, the war ended on the Western Front, continued on the Eastern Front as multiple stakeholders tried to grab this Ukrainian territory. Pihulovich survives. She survived the longer Bolshevik occupation of 1919, street violence of Denikin, and the desperate grab of Petlura, allied with the Poles to continue the Ukrainian political project in Kiev in May 1920. And this whole time, in war, she's studying to become an actress. From 1920 to 1922, Zina and her classmates worked in theater in Kiev under the new Bolshevik regime, earning salaries that apparently were like wads of nearly useless paper cash. But they needed these wads of paper cash to survive. But in this period of instability, she learned her profession, and she learned it pretty well. She was actually the assistant to Kurbas on his now very famous 1924 Macbeth. She led vocal training for the Berezil company, and she ended up going to Moscow to train, but she returned to Soviet Ukraine to head the puppet theater in 1931. She actually then founded puppet theaters all over Soviet Ukraine and even herself made puppets. She went on to have a very, very interesting career beyond Kurbas. But her life was changed by war. So were those of all of her classmates. Olympia Dobrovolska, pictured here at the top, actually did not stay in Kiev. She went west in 1919, following the Ukrainian People's Republic to Kamianets-Podilsky. But then she returned east, eventually, to Kurbas and Soviet Ukraine in 1922. Apparently with several colleagues, she spent a night in a train with corpses from the Ukrainian Galician army. Hanna Babiivna, pictured here on the left, was a teacher from Habsburg, Galicia, who followed her boyfriend and a dream of theater east to find Kurbas in 1920, crossing the front lines in, honestly, once I mapped out like where everybody was at that time, made me wonder how on earth they made it, but they did. They somehow made it to Kurbas outside Kiev in 1920. So this cohort of young women doing theater in war was young, idealistic, risk-taking. Theater was their touchstone and the place to which they always returned, whatever government was in power. And their commitment to theater, whether puppets or Berezil, emerged precisely from the violence of war. Experiencing urban violence in Kiev, the danger of checkpoints, uncertain journeys, hunger, adrenaline, working together. And this actually distinguishes the avant-garde in Ukraine from other places. Its makers all, when you track their biographies, emerged from a war-torn landscape. So discussions of the avant-garde in greater Slavic studies actually rarely focus on war, but in Ukraine, these artistic movements were profoundly shaped by war. And when we track these theater women's biographies, the significance of war is clear. And this war changed their life paths. Zina Pavlovich would have been a medical student and a doctor, for example, but she became an actress and a puppet maker. This period is not only a revolutionary one aesthetically with Kurbas, but also professionally, with women moving into positions they never would have had previously. And we see this huge shift in Ukrainian society and Ukrainian theater when we look through the lens of women. Women and war help us see theater, the avant-garde, in a new way. So our second case study shifts forward, again, to war. I'll turn now to World War II and a later generation, and to a student at the theater school in Kiev who probably crossed paths with Zinaida Pihulovich because she ended up working in the puppet theater in Kiev, Dina Pronicheva. Dina is actually well known by scholars, but not scholars of Ukrainian studies or of Ukrainian theater, but she should be. She is well known by scholars of the Holocaust. She is one of 29 survivors of the war crime of Baba Yar, when the Nazis, with collaborators, massacred over 33,000 Jews in 2 days in Kiev. She told her story in January 1946 at one of the early war crime trials, pictured here below, and again several months later to the Commission on the History of the Great Patriotic War. Her testimony has been central to understanding this crime and to the Holocaust in general. But no one has paid attention to the fact that she too was a theater woman in Ukraine. Theater actually helped her survive during and after the war. So after surviving Baba Yar, she puts her acting skills to use and she becomes Nadia Savchenko. That's the name that she takes. And she becomes a Ukrainian woman, and in a long story, which involves working in a factory, befriending a Ukrainian woman who ends up helping her and actually becomes one of the righteous among the nations in Yad Vashem, being arrested by the Gestapo, saved by partisans, in a very, very long story. She ends up walking almost barefoot from Kiev to Bila Tsirkva, which isn't that far, but pretty far if you imagine walking almost barefoot. And again, taking up this role of this Ukrainian actress, Nadia Savchenko, and playing in a theater in Bila Tsirkva and surrounding towns from spring 1942 to December 1943, when the Soviets liberated the Kiev region. And her story is truly extraordinary. So Dina could have left Kiev, she should have left Kiev, and gone east to Central Asia in 1941. I should say almost all of the actors in the Yiddish theater, there are several state Yiddish theaters, almost all of them evacuated with state help or without state help to Central Asia. But she wasn't an actress in the Yiddish theater. She was a Jewish actress working in Ukrainian and Russian at the puppet theater in Kiev. She didn't evacuate. But she survived through war, through theater. She does whatever job's necessary at the theater. She acts, she takes tickets, she does administrative work in order to stay employed. She's denounced at least once, but saved by a tech worker. She has to serve as an MC in German for a cabaret night for the Nazi occupiers at one point, and she does it. She plays a feisty actress who has torn her skirt, and she orders the few Jews remaining in a local ghetto to fix her skirt. So she creates this whole ruse, right? But with that ruse, she's able to sneak in food from a local market to the 38 Jews remaining in the ghetto in Bruges in 1943. But she notes that this was to no avail. She and her company watched as the Jews were marched out and shot several days later. So that is, she witnessed the Holocaust even as she's a Holocaust survivor. And in theater, her world, right, the world of those who should have left, collides with the world of Ukrainian actresses, those who stayed under Nazi occupation, surviving Nazi occupation, and preserving their sense of Ukrainian culture. And interestingly, Dina was probably performing these 19th century Ukrainian melodramas. These are plays, if you haven't read them, that depict rural life and tragic love affairs using song and dance, would have been familiar to the local population, and with the songs and dances would also have been appealing to the German occupiers. Kudryavtsy's famous Natalka Poltavka, which tells of Natalka's successful struggle to marry her true love against many obstacles, was performed actually in 39 of the 45 theaters operating under Nazi occupation. Mayhill and Svetlana Maximenko have argued that theater was a space where Ukrainian culture could be preserved, right, even in very difficult conditions. But when we put Dina in this story, we also see that theater under Nazi occupation was a place, however precarious, where actually bodies could be preserved. Theater literally saved Dina's life. So the greater historical context to Ukrainian theater under Nazi occupation makes it a much more complex phenomenon. Vitaly Hadagura has found several other cases of Jewish artists passing under the Germans through their work in theater, hiding in plain sight. So Ukraine, therefore, offers a case of the ways that theater can be a refuge in war. And I won't lie, it's a precarious one, it's a slippery one, right? But it is a refuge nonetheless. Theater can be a place where the actual production might not matter, right? Dina never mentions, what role she's performing or what plays they're doing. But the building matters, right? Employment matters. The community of silence, right, that must have been operating for Jewish artists to survive matters, right? We also see how theater and violence are not separate stories, but really, really intertwined. After all, Dina and her whole theater company saw the Jews shot. Ukrainian theater artists witnessed the Holocaust. These are not separate stories, but part of one story of Ukraine during war. Dina's story also shapes our understanding of theater and war. Her testimony, as she speaks it, as it's recorded for this commission, reveals a very physical, embodied aspect of her experience. And bodies are central to live theater, if you think about it. Theater is very physical. So surviving in theater, therefore, demands bodily intimacy. The everyday practices, dressing and undressing, right? Nakedness among your fellow artists, putting on, taking off makeup, sweating on stage under theatrical lighting, or trying to stay warm on stage in winter, traveling closely packed in vans to a touring location, all attest to the requirement of showing the body, not only on stage, but also off stage. Considering her story through physicality, as Dina moved through occupied cities, performed on stage, performed off stage, she made choices for her children. She actually has 2 children who actually survive this period. Suggests a window into the ephemeral and mysterious relationship between the work and the life. Performance studies scholar Deanna Taylor's work on Latin America helps clarify the importance of the body in a way that might not show up in archives. So she shows how local knowledge is preserved through folk festivals and rituals. Bodies, she argues, carry as much knowledge as archival documents. And she asks, how does performance transmit knowledge about the past in ways that allow us to understand it and to use it? So as scholars, we might consider what the body might pass on when analyzing the past. So inspired by Taylor then, let us consider the way Dina's story inscribes itself on her body, right? So there's an arm that was apparently stepped on by a German boot in the ravine at Babin-Yar. Feet that make it to Bila Tsirkva, and only in, as she says, tattered sandals. Her body beaten from her imprisonment in Kiev. Her eyes and ears that witnessed the murder of the Jews to whom she gave food. Her mind, her mouth speaking German, words as a conferencier, MC. Her tears she describes as she embraces her daughter, whom she finds in 1944 in Kiev, and the nakedness she describes feeling even after liberation. The testimony actually has a deeply physical aspect, revealed in her choice of words, her choice of verbs, her choice of details. And this extremity of violence in Ukraine affected women as artists, but also as bodies. And it's by considering the body and women's bodies that we can attempt to understand the ways that theater and life intersect and intertwine in extreme times. So what about the women in theater today? Let's move forwards. Like Zina Pikalovic in the revolutionary years, and Dina Pronicheva under Nazi occupation in the worst conditions, for women in theater today, theater seems to be a touchstone, a pathway, a means of understanding what is happening, and the only way they know how to live through this period. But of course, there's been a shift in gender dynamics since the times of Zina Pikalovic and Dina Pronicheva after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with more women taking up leading positions in the arts. So theater women are increasingly not just actresses, right, but directors and artistic directors, managers, playwrights, etc. There are also 2015 theater laws that mandated actually open calls every 5 years for leading administrative positions. There are challenges with these laws, to be sure, but they did result, very interestingly, in kind of a cohort of women kind of immediately entering administrative positions in theaters. It's not everywhere, but it is very noticeable. Women are more present in positions of authority. And I have some of them pictured here. This is a photo from the first ever Ukrainian Shakespeare Festival this past summer in Ivano-Frankivsk, and we have some theater women. So on the left, director Oksana Dmitrieva, whom I will talk about shortly. On the far right, director Tamara Trunova. Next to Oksana Dmitrieva, Irina Chuzhinova, who actually organized the whole festival. Her name is not on the posters, but it was she who actually did all of the work of organizing. And in the middle, Yana Partola, who's a major theater scholar from Kharkiv. So here are some of the theater women today. And here I want to bring in Carol Cohn, who writes so compellingly about women and war. And for her, she says, gender is, at its heart, a structural power relation. So observing or tracking women in Ukrainian war today, it's a process. We're still in the middle of that process, so it's maybe more difficult to make definitive arguments. But I do see women, like these women, in theater as shaping the narrative of war in ways that just did not happen in the Soviet period. Theater women are challenging precisely those structural power relations, right? So let me explain that. This war is over several things. One of those things is power, right? Refusing domination by Russia and deep questioning of the ages-long assertion of Russian domination of Ukraine. But making those assertions opens the door to questioning structural power relations elsewhere, beyond Russia and Ukraine, including gender dynamics inside Ukraine. So, for example, one female former theater student, soon joined by many others, revealed sexual harassment by Andriy Belouz, the artistic director of Kiev's Molodityak Young Theater, and a primary acting teacher at Karpenko-Kari Theater Institute in Kiev. So she revealed what had happened to her when she was a student at the school, and many other students kind of joined in. Students and colleagues have protested the intransigence of the school administration in dealing with the issue, and have recently expressed anger and frustration today at the reinstallation of Belouz back at the theater, although apparently he's not back at the theater school. But this opening for the student to speak out and in her video confession and for it to go so viral came because of the war, I think, right? Questioning power in one place raises the question of its deployment in other places. And let's return to gender here. The assumption is that female theater artists should have a certain set of characteristics and should play into patterns of male sexual dominance in order to have a career. With students resisting those hierarchies and categories, changes in theater education could one day follow. Now again, we don't know what's going to happen. We're still in the middle of things, right? I don't want this picture to sound too rosy, but it is very interesting when I hear my own theater students, many of whom are very amazing young theater women, kind of talk about what they want to do and push against the system, right? I do think change will happen, and I think that push is coming from the war. Now, the main focus of renewed attention to theater in the Western press is a play, a production called Konotopska Viduma, right, or The Witch of Konotop, which is an early 19th century melodrama by Krika Oslovyanenko, of course, reconsidered and refigured for today. It sells out in minutes at the Ivan Theater in Kiev. The theater actually sells tickets that cost up to 2,000 hryvnia, which is far more than other shows. In case you were thinking of going, the April shows are already sold out. This is a show by director Ivan Berezil, designer Petro Bohomazov, son of Dmitro Bohomazov, who is the artistic director of the theater. Honestly, it's probably great. I actually wish I could see it. But I will say my female students complain about the way that the team can portray women. And it's lauded in the Western press as being this sort of very simple story of, resistance through theater, right? But theater and war is not as simple as just resistance. It is resistance. But when we look at women, we see a different picture. One that I think is of starting to build a more complex and maybe difficult narrative of the war. And beyond Berezil, there's a lot of really interesting work being done right now by female directors. And let me remind us of the basic fact that there were very few female theater directors in the Soviet period. And very few emerged in the period of independence, but right now during war, there are several that we could talk about. For example, Tamara Trunova, whose production of Natalia Voroshbit's Bohani Dorogi, or Bad Roads, won the 2019 Ukrainian Award for Best Theater Production. She just opened a production of the opera The Moon by Karl Orff, so she's a very diverse theater director. And she actually wrote, it's not that there's no women in Ukrainian theater, but it's that they are shadowed, not equal, not evenly represented. This is terrible, and it requires urgent reflection in terms of what is happening in the theater system. So she's naming, right, Carol Cohn's structural power dynamics in so many words, and I think her work is really pushing against those hierarchies. Another director, Rosa Sarkisian, whose show is pictured here, now working in Poland, has written that war stories, and she's referring to World War II, tend to run over traumatic experiences like a bulldozer. And clearly that is not what she is doing. Shows like Fucking Truffaut in Warsaw, which is a queer cabaret about war but not about war, are just pushing forward the medium of theater, full stop. And Oksana Dmitrieva, whom I'll focus on a bit more, is from Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine. She was given the title in 2006 of Honored Artist of Autonomous Crimea, where she worked for a few years. She trained in Dnipro and Kharkiv, and in 2007 began leading the puppet theater in Kharkiv. One of her shows actually was a series of Chekhov shorts, one of which was Rothschild's Fiddle. It was completely, honestly, one of the most beautiful theater experiences I've had in 2009. It really made me understand what puppet theater can be, right? There's a synergy between the puppets and the live actors. It was gorgeous. When the full-scale invasion happened, she and some of the actors and her students did theater in the metro in Kharkiv. And she started to be invited to work at other theaters. So for the Maria Zakhovatska Theater in Lviv, she made Shakespeare's Tempest for a new performance space in the attic. I got to see it last summer at this first ever Ukrainian Shakespeare Festival in Ivano-Frankivsk. where it was performed in the bomb shelter and basement of the theater. So this production is about war, indirectly, right? Prospero, in the play, comes to the island because of war. He's overthrown, right? He has to flee with his daughter Miranda. He causes violence, right? With his magic. He causes a shipwreck in a storm that brings his enemies to him for retribution. Characters in the play, the design was that they wore these striped kind of military shirts and pajama things that were clearly an allusion to the Russian military, right? So the allusion to war was obvious. But more subtly, the show was about the different kinds of power and domination that we can have. So sexual, between Miranda and Ferdinand. Emotional and psychological, between Prospero and Ariel, his spirit servant, and Caliban, right, the indigenous creature left on the island, abused and abandoned by two other characters, Trinculo and Stefano, and those are normally very comic scenes, and in this production she made it really kind of violent and upsetting to watch, right, these two characters sort of torturing this actor. The production ended, spoiler alert, with Caliban sitting alone on stage, right? So we've already applauded, everyone else has gone off, but this actor playing Caliban is still there. It was this incredibly awkward moment. No one knew what to do. Was the show over? Were we supposed to like get up and move around him? Were we supposed to applaud more? Maybe we were complicit in his torture and abandonment. So the show ended on this moment of incredibly awkward and uncomfortable ambiguity and uncertainty, which is very Shakespearean, and which seems to really resonate through Dmitrieva's work during war. And in an interview she says, "I cannot help but talk about the war, because it's present in my life and I cannot think about anything else." But her stories of war are not transparent, right? They're not easy, they're ambiguous. Her recent Medea, for example, at the Ivano-Frankivsk Theater is not actually, apparently I haven't seen it, so this is just from reviews, is not centered around Jason's betrayal of Medea, and then she kills her children, right? But about Medea's betrayal of her homeland as she's helped Jason get the golden fleece, right, which sets off the story. Dmitrieva's production of Othello at the Left Bank Theater in Kiev brought the audience returning veterans, Othello and Iago, with PTSD, unable to leave the war behind. So Iago is sort of less a complete evil enemy, right, but also someone like Othello who's really suffering from war, unable to let it go. And of course, this reflects on current issues in Ukrainian society at war. Dmitrieva and the other theater women today are, I think, changing the structural power dynamics in Ukrainian theater by creating precisely the stories that help Ukraine make sense of itself, in Marvin Carlson's terms. How do you make sense of yourself at this time, right? That's very difficult. I think their directing is like a feminist practice that involves questioning the hierarchies, exposing power dynamics, and putting images on stage to that which might be uncomfortable, whether Medea's betrayal, or Othello and Iago's PTSD, or Prospero's cruelty, or our own complicity. But the past, of course, helps us see and understand the present. And I want to point to a resonance I have been noticing more and more with the Berezil women, or the women of Revolutionary era Ukraine in the 1920s and today. Those women, too, had lives transformed by war and violence. Ironically, that war, violence, and the collapse of their worlds led to opportunities for professional work in the theater that wouldn't have been either inaccessible or very hard to have been accessible for them previously. Teachers, medical students, housewives became theater professionals. In the same way, war is forcing change today. It is opening up opportunities in painful ways. So many men are at the front, so plays with women are being produced all over Ukraine. Women have stepped into positions of authority that might have provoked more resistance, right, had it not been for war. Many women have also created connections abroad and come back to Ukraine to work, right? That back and forth is impossible for men, but women are doing that quite a bit, bringing that experience and connections with them. Like the Berezil women, women today are involved in making theater during war, and like Zina Picholovich and a few others, they are involved also in the creation of stories, and not just inhabiting stories created by men. And like the women pushing against social hierarchies to have stage careers, young students today are pushing against old hierarchies that keep them, their voices, their stories, subservient to men in power. I see an interesting resonance, too, with women in theater after World War II. The Soviet state could not handle ambiguity or complexity in its story of war, that's speaking very broadly, and there were no structures really to help society handle that experience of war after the violence. There was no space, for example, for Dina to talk about her experience, right? She talked about the war crime of Babin Yar, but she couldn't really talk about how she brought her experience to work in the post-war puppet theater. That remains a mystery to me. How did she come back to work? Nor were women really in positions of power. We see the structured gender relations really emerging again after World War II. So for example, Natalia Ujvi, who's a very famous stage and screen actress, does head the theater workers union after the war, but we would say a lot of the work that she was doing is emotional labor, right, and care work. So she's heading this union, and much of it involves getting a ton of mail from members who are asking for help after the war, right? They've lost everything, they don't have things. They write to Natalia Ujvi, right, to get help. It's men who are heading the theater companies and writing the plays that are creating and producing and spreading those stories of war. So what will happen in this post-war? Will we have a new Berezil generation? I actually think we will. I think I see it in the young people making work today in Ukraine. Will it include women, women's stories, the stories of formerly marginalized voices? I'm following artists like Oksana Dmitrieva, who may be creating a theater that can be a space for those uncomfortable stories of war that do exist but that are less spoken today. So let me return to what I said I would tell you. Theater helps us know things about society. We learn about Ukraine by examining theater, right? Oksana Dmitrieva's Tempest tells us about shifting power hierarchies in war. The one lone Berezil show, written and directed by women, tells us something about the place of women in the avant-garde. When we include women in the picture, we see a different picture. We see the huge revolution in professionalization in the 1920s, for example, resonant with the ways women are changing theater today. Theater is resistance, yeah. But it's also a patriarchal system that young people really want to change. And war has consistently shaped theater in Ukraine. This is sadly a specificity of Ukraine. So Ukrainian studies should be part of larger conversations on theater in post-wars. We hope for post-war Berezils, and we already see the women creating them. So putting together, I think, women in theater and war gives a picture of Ukraine as a specific region. We see place. We see the power of place and the specificity of place and the ways that place shapes experience. Ukraine is part of larger stories. The Russian Empire, Habsburg Empire, collapse in the post-revolutionary years, Soviet Union. It's part of those entities, but a specific part. The ways that Sovietness unfolded in Ukraine was different than the ways it unfolded in Moscow or Tashkent or Tbilisi. Of course, there's similarities, but there's also differences, and those differences are important. So drawing together these themes, we see that, women in war is not a side story or a footnote or a human interest story, as Cynthia Enloe would say. It's the real story of war. It is the story, or at least one of the stories. Women's lives, often marginalized in theater scholarship or news reporting today, actually allow us to see how the creative landscape shifts and changes. The stories society tells us about society. I hope that women keep telling stories and stories of women so we can understand this war and what will be in its post-war. Thank you very much.